Today we see the situation clearly. If Russia turns the Istanbul meeting into an empty talk, there must be a new level of pressure, new sanctions, and not just from Europe. We need to work on joint sanctions at the G7 level, including with the United States and with everyone in the world who wants peace. It's very, very important that each of our partners supports this exact approach.
According to President Zelensky, peace talks between Ukraine and Russia are happening as we speak, with negotiators meeting in the Turkish city of Istanbul. It's just 24 hours after a Ukrainian operation thousands of miles behind the front lines destroyed strategic Russian bomber planes. Catherine Philp is the Times' World Affairs editor, and she is in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. A very good afternoon from us in London, Catherine. Let's talk through, what can increasingly seem like the gap between expectation and reality. What are the realistic hopes for these negotiations, do you think?
Hi there. Well, it's a great question. Although we talk about these talks being very important because of what's at stake, I think it's hard to overstate how far apart the two sides are, even before the drone strikes yesterday by Ukraine deep into Russian territory. And so what we know about them is really that they are so far apart on the basic principles on which they are negotiating, which include issues like whether the international community should recognize Russian sovereignty over areas of Ukraine that are controlled by Russia, and whether Ukraine stop mobilizing soldiers for the front. These very basic issues they cannot agree on. And it's very hard to see what progress they'll make in the course of this one day of talks, which is obviously just the latest in several of these meetings.
What's always important is who's in the room. So who's actually attending here?
Well, again, this is one of the issues. It's not a very high-level delegation. The Russians have consistently kept their representation low, and the Ukrainians have responded in kind. So it is from the Ukrainian side, you've got the defense minister there. So essentially, you haven't got people who are able to shift the basic parameters of negotiations in the room. You've also got Steve Witkoff, increasingly the envoy for everything, the golfing buddy and diplomatic neophyte that Donald Trump has put his faith in to solve almost every conflict on the face of the earth within months of taking office. So that's the level we're talking about. Now, there has been an offer from the Ukrainians that should things progress further, President Zelensky is indeed willing to meet face-to-face with Vladimir Putin. But that is not something that Putin himself is keen on. He is much keener to meet directly with Donald Trump because he sees that as his equal, not Zelensky.
Let's talk about things that happened over the last couple of days in terms of military action. The Spider's Web operation, which was daring and successful, daring in its ambition, Catherine, wasn't it? What's that likely to do in terms of how Russia now sees its position? And maybe for people who aren't entirely clear about what Spider's Web was, you could explain that.
Sure. So right after we'd suffered, I think, the heaviest Russian bombardment, overnight bombardment of Ukraine during the entire invasion since 2022. Operation Spider's Web happened during the day yesterday, in which the first indications we got was smoke rising from several air bases across Russia, in very far apart in 3 different time zones, including as far away as Siberia, which then turned out to have been drone attacks by Ukrainian forces, by the intelligence services here. Essentially, what they'd done was they'd smuggled these tiny drones across the border into Russia, packed them into containers. They then tricked Russian truck drivers into delivering them as cargo to locations close to where those air bases were, at which point they were triggered remotely and then hit these air bases. bombers. The Ukrainians claim to have hit 41 of Russia's long-range strategic and nuclear-capable bombers. That would be a third of their entire fleet. And today have said that 13 of them were completely destroyed and others were damaged. Now, this has caused absolute consternation in Russia. There have been comparisons to Pearl Harbor, the implication being that the Ukrainians could not have pulled this off on their own, that it must have had Western backing. There's absolutely no evidence of that, because everything that was used was domestically produced by the Ukrainians. And we know that indeed Washington was not informed in advance of this attack, nor were any of the other NATO allies. So Russia's absorbing the scale of this shock. It's called it terrorism, which is a bizarre term to use, given that these were purely military targets. But I think really what Russia now has to consider is that this is essentially what Ukraine's trying to demonstrate to Russia, is that the cost of continuing the war is higher than Russia might wish to bear. Now, that in conventional terms has not been possible really for Ukraine to inflict on Russia, because it's so much bigger. It has, so many more missiles and bombers and that kind of weaponry at which it can throw at Ukraine that Ukraine doesn't have. And critically, it has millions more in manpower that it can send to the front. If you can effectively disable a third of the fleet of long-range bombers, given that they are nuclear capable, you're not only changing the calculus of the war in Ukraine, you're also tipping the kind of threat that Russia can actually credibly pose to NATO, and even including the kind of nuclear threats it can convey to the West. So essentially, Russia now has to consider, could this happen again? And is the cost of continuing this war in Ukraine higher than it may be prepared to bear?
Yep. I mean, as you've clearly detailed there, it really has been quite the show of strength from Ukraine. Given Putin's chest-beating approach to the world, not even just to Ukraine, it will surely provoke an aggressive response, not a retreat. I completely hear you when you describe, the sheer scale of the damage done to Russia, but just the character of the man, the character of Putin. He's a guy who you kind of think, well, if you punch him, he just wants to punch back even harder, not taking note of the facts available to him.
Absolutely. And that is exactly what we have all been expecting here. Now, I think it's interesting that last night, as opposed to the night before, we had much lower level of bombardment across Ukraine, particularly fewer missiles. Most of the attacks were carried out by drones. So certainly in the short term, it may have done something to inhibit Russia's ability to strike back. We are obviously expecting something more destructive and vicious to come Ukraine's way. But again, the issue is really less about what happens on the battlefield and more what Russia's strategic calculation is having suffered this blow.
And just a final thought from you, Catherine. Obviously, with all of these negotiations, it's incredibly important for both sides to come out of them being able to tell a story that they want to tell. So what do you think if the negotiations come to the prime sum of nothing? What is the story that both sides will be telling tomorrow, the day after?
Well, I think we already know what Ukraine will say, because it said it repeatedly, which is that Vladimir Putin is not serious about peace and is dragging out this process for the sake of it. Russia will presumably say that Ukraine is being intransigent or in some other way dismissing it. The fact is that Russia has, to this point at least, believe that it can win this militarily, and so the charge that it is dragging the conflict out, I think, is valid. I think the critical factor is how Washington responds to this, and in particular, President Trump, who has threatened to walk away from this process of mediation, given that he's finding it rather more challenging than he initially assessed he would when he said it it could be done in 24 hours and then 100 days and so on. So I think the question is, how does Washington react to this? Does Trump say enough is enough, this process is going nowhere, and thus walk away? Now that would, that could be a huge blow to Ukraine, obviously, because it would deny that American support. But the message that Washington has been putting out recently is that Ukraine is losing this war. So I think one of the considerations for that with Operation Spider's Web is Ukraine's attempt to demonstrate that it is still in this fight and it has asymmetric methods by which it can still punish Russia and make the cost of war too heavy.
Catherine, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much. Catherine Philp is the Times' World Affairs editor, joining us from Kyiv.